For this assignment, the social theory that really caught my eye is the theory of external restraint. This theory came about in 1954 by two sociologists by the name of Andrew Henry and James Short. Essentially, what they believe is that external restraint can be categorized as laws, rules, or social norms, and essentially what they do is it's the amount of social control over one's actions that limits the freedom and the ability to do an action. Um, with heavy external restraint, it bears down on a person and it can manifest in feelings of frustration, which end up causing them to commit an act of aggression. The same thing can occur with someone who suffers weaker external restraint. Um, they still get the same frustration, but since they don't really have anywhere to direct it at, it stays more internalized than kind of bursting outward. According to Short and Henry, with heavy external restraint, people, when they lash out, they tend to commit acts of homicide. So they lash out against other people and they end up killing someone. With weaker external restraint, the internalized feelings of frustration and anger, they manifest themselves and cause someone to commit an act of aggression. But since they don't really have anyone to target against them or target against, they usually end up lashing out against themselves and committing an act of suicide. The theory is actually fairly interesting in the way that they explain everything. Um, there's not a lot of testing to be found on this, but it was later expanded in 1958 by a Martin Gold, another sociologist, and he actually expanded the theory to kind of cover children, which is where it starts to get really interesting. Essentially, what he talks about is there are two forms of socialization for kids. Uh, he bases it off of physical and psychological punishment in order to deter the child from misbehaving. Again, they fall under the same categories of external restraint. The physical one falls under the heavier external restraint, and the psychological falls under the lighter external restraint. Again, with the heavier, it is seen that more people tend to focus their aggression outward and commit an act of homicide, whereas the people that suffer from lighter external restraint, they internalize that anger and frustration and commit acts of suicide. So obviously the physical punishments that children would endure, spankings, getting the switch, beatings, stuff like that, it manifests itself into aggression towards other people because they can outwardly direct it at someone. Whenever that happens, they grow, and then when they're at the age to really ready to commit an act of aggression, they end up externalizing it and they commit homicide. With the children that suffer psychological punishment, the psychological punishment ranges between stuff like taking away different items, threatening to take away love, which is just cruel, and also lecturing to induce guilt. Essentially, what it does is it makes the child feel like it's their fault, this is their issue, and still they get that frustration and that anger, but it's directed inward at them. When they grow up, again, they're ready to commit an act of aggression. When it happens, since they grow up with these feelings of just internalized guilt and hate, it ends up being directed at themselves and they end up committing suicide. So that's really what the theory goes over. So there is some merit to what Gold is saying, though it is, in my opinion, really difficult to find a blanket solution to really any one problem. He does have actual support from FBI statistics, stating like the homicide rates in the southern states, along with the classes and races that are more prone to physical punishment than others in the U.S. So FBI statistics state that the highest homicide rates are among black or African Americans and also in the southern states, both of which are pretty well known for instituting physical punishment on growing children. Here in Texas, really, I've grown up with both corporal and psychological punishment. I have friends who have grown with both of them. It's a very common thing down here, but it's really difficult to think that something that innocuous might lead to something so severe down the road. That's why later on in the text, it actually states that there's a third variable, and that is the excessive use of these items. And that really does put it more into perspective because it's really difficult to think that just something like that can cause such huge problems down the road. But if you think about it, someone who's just constantly beaten, no matter what they're doing, it really does make a lot more sense. So that's more or less the gist of the theory. That's all the time I have, and I hope this video was informative. Good night.